Wow, that was quite a video you put together, Rohny Saylors. Gosh, it's so stylized and very visual and visceral. Are you afraid that its entertainment-like qualities would undermine the credibility to the message that you're trying to bring?
You know, it's not a unique message. There have been a lot of scholars, I've got the research ready to talk about, that have pointed out things like fragility exists, whiteness exists, whiteness was invented, they've traced back where whiteness came from. And, you know, the fact, the body of fact, the historical body of fact is out there. So it would seem to me that what's missing is the ability to bridge that gap between people who hear whiteness and think it's like genocide against the white race, when really it's saying, hey, look, an identity around a race is invented, right? And if the identity around a race is invented, well, what do we have left? Well, we have nationality and we have our humanity. So yeah, I think it's good to be stylized. I think it's good to have this sort of like visual appeal, because that helps folks stick with it and hear what there is to be said.
So you're saying after we get rid of the invented racial identity, all we have left is our nationality. With how much, like, even schools are neglecting to celebrate being American to begin with, what are those that are from America going to have?
Right. So we see that there's this accusation that without whiteness, right, without white superiority, or at very least without whiteness as a culture, America doesn't exist. And the truth is that our founding was around racial superiority of whites over blacks. It was a bigoted beginning. So, you know, when people say, what does America look like? And how can we have America? And how can we celebrate America? And what's with people not celebrating America anymore? It feels like enemies, right? It feels like those people who want to tear down America. But it's not how I see it. I think that, in fact, the beauty of this country is our ability to create a great experiment in humanity instead of just, you know, white humanity. We can have everyone together and celebrate that of us, that we are open, that we are accepting, that unlike many places in the world, you can be here and be different. And that doesn't make you a bad person. What makes you good or bad is the content of your character, not the color of your skin, right? If your character is good, that's what matters in America, and that's what we should celebrate. And I absolutely get the people who are saying, hey, but you're saying that a person is their race, not the content of their character. No, that's the opposite of where we're going with this, right? Where we're going with this is exactly where you're saying, to be celebrating the United States of America and its birthing a greater place to live for everyone. And we're always becoming that thing. And we've always been becoming that thing since that initial error, right? The stock owners taking the laborers and just putting them at each other, white versus black. And I think if we get back to that, we can look at all the love and all the potential that America's always had, and the light it's been for the world in terms of our ethics, our values, right? We are an authority on the sanctity of humanity, right?
I cued in on the stock ownership that you're talking about, and you emphasize the livestock ownership. But are you relating this to modern stock ownership?
Right, yeah. So for sure, that's the tradition, right? The British had a capitalist structure for funding ventures. We have a capitalist structure for funding ventures. And because of that structure, we have the ownership class that put whites versus blacks against each other. Since then, the majority of the people with influence, right, that top 20% or so whose votes are pretty much what happens in Congress, now they're the stock ownership. So we've gone from 1/10 of 1% to 20% with stock ownership. Now, there are two directions to go with that, right? Some would say you should abolish capitalism. And the moment you say that, people think you're trying to abolish free markets. And the truth is that, as we see always throughout history, when the stock market starts underperforming relative to its past, it starts itself forcing an end to the free market. And that's a dangerous situation. I think we can imagine a time when, not too distant from now, when Amazon and Jeff Bezos are worth trillions of dollars. And the only way for that stock to keep growing is for them to make multiples of trillions of dollars, right? That's just how the stock market works. So I think a lot of people don't know this. The value of a share, right, is all the money that the firm's going to make in the future. But we can't know what that is, right? So what we do is the finance formula figures out what the growth was and then takes all that back together and gives you what's called the net present value of all future cash flows, right? So it assumes a consistent rate of growth of profit, not just a consistent profit, not just a consistent growth in profit, but consistent rate. So for example, if you go from 1 million last year to 2 million this year, if you make 3 million next year, your stock price goes down because all you did was grow that profit. Of course, if you make 2 million next year, just like you did this year, your stock price will go down too because it's assuming growth. But even if you make another million, just like you did last year, your stock price goes down. No, you doubled your profit. So you got to go from 1 million to 2 million, 2 million to 4 million, and that's just to keep the price of that stock level. If you then want your executive bonus for making the price of the stock go up, you need to increase the rate of growth. And that is, so there's this rule about reality. Every exponential growth curve like that is the beginning of an S curve that stops curving. At some point you run out. And that's just how the stock market has to go. So it builds in booms and busts into the formula for capitalism. And so, yeah, there's other ways to do free open markets that don't have this boom bust cycle.
I noticed that you mentioned that these stock owners have that political voice. So is what you're doing right now a political statement?
Yeah. So you can see that as the stock grows and grows and grows, it has to destroy that market, the free market, the ability to be entrepreneurial, which is what I'm a professor of at Washington State University. And I'm not speaking for my university there, or at all, just myself. But what happens is the government starts getting controlled by the corporations. And over the past 400 years of capitalism, right, stock ownership in order to fund ventures. Over and over again, we've seen the corporations grow large, they capture the military of the nation and use it to make the stock owners even more money. And that's why we had the British Empire. That's why we have had totalitarian regimes rise up in the past. And usually what it is, the wealth becomes so unequal. The people rise up and they say, hey, we are not going to tolerate you owning like everything. So what happens? People who own like everything say, we won't tolerate you taking it from us. So they take away democracy and replace it with, well, fascism. And so, for example, Hitler rose to power, not National Socialist was his party title, but he rose to power saying he was stopping a socialist revolution. And then he argued for how his revolution hadn't killed nearly as many as the socialist revolutions had, so his was due a few to murder. So Hitler's a dark subject, but those dark times in human history, and the British have had camps like this as well, just 100 years prior. These dark times in history are pushed by the stock owners in society. And we're in a similar situation in this society, and I'm hoping that the American experiment is something greater than the push towards fascism that comes from a late in the game capital structure. Because think about this, that 20%, I'm in it, right? I'm a professor. I've got a retirement portfolio. I've made a lot of money under the Trump administration. And, if my retirement portfolio is going to play out, and because I'm just a professor, right? If it's going to play out the way people's retirement portfolios have played out in the past, that means Jeff Bezos has got to be a multi-trillionaire by the time I'm ready to retire. So is that okay? Is it okay that 8 people on Earth own half the wealth? And then if I want what I have to double, right? What they have has to double. But what I have is so much less than what they have. Let's say they have $1 billion and I have $1 million. Well, when they have 2 billion and I have 2 million, they have 500 times more that they've made. So that means exponentially more and more, the wealth will be in fewer and fewer hands. It has to work that way. That's how stock markets work. And when we hitched our wagon to a stock market, we made it work that way. Now that is an observation of fact. That's just how numbers work, right? There's no question that's how that works. So that's not a political statement. Saying that's a bad thing, well, that's an interpretation based on the facts of history and how numbers have to work. Saying, therefore, we should support Bernie Sanders, well, that's a political statement. Or similarly, Trump has created more wealth in America than any president before him in only 3 years. Well, that's also a statement. It's a factual statement that's attributing it to Trump, saying he did it, it was done because of the tax cuts. Well, that's a statement that's connected to a more political question, but it doesn't tell you how you have to vote, right? Or that you have to like the tax cuts. There's all sorts of trade-offs. So the same thing with whiteness, right? We have a history of whiteness. We see the behaviors that created that sense of superiority that connects with being in a fragile, superior place and having to enforce it. That is a statement. The history is a fact. The fragility is an interpretation of that history with potentially political implications. And the solutions themselves, again, don't tell you which side to vote on. I mean, it wouldn't be hard for Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, or the Green Party to pick up on the recommendations that would fix the problem. So that means it's not partisan. And that's really, in America, when we talk about political and we're concerned about it, it's not because people debate it, right? Everyone debates everything. It's a question of whether or not it says, now this is the only party to go with, because that's what we're doing here. And the fact is that with the rise of single-issue voters, it feels more and more like you can't believe anything without being a partisan. And that's simply not true. That's simply not true. So when you say it's political, all speech makes a political point. But does it say you have to vote one direction or another if you believe this? Not at all, right? It's not a campaign for a particular person or a particular party. It's a statement of ideas, a statement of historical fact, some interpretation of the meaning of that historical fact, and some suggestions for future action. So, yeah, I mean, as a professor, I try and avoid entanglements with things that are controversial, but at this point, the facts just have to be shared.
I notice you say that based on our fragility, we have armed the forces to protect the stocks. So is this how you're relating white supremacy and linking it to police violence?
Right. So when that white middle class was created, that group, but by pushing down the blacks and forcing people who had indentured contracts into slavery, then focusing on importing slaves, we see the rise of a person with a star on their lapel, and that person is the slave catcher. And enforcing the owners, the stock owners' rule over those who labor at the bottom rung is the history of creating police force, at least patrolmen, in the United States. Now, no more would I expect some random white person walking along the street to engage in racist behavior than would I expect a patrolman to engage in racist behavior or slave master-like behavior. But every once in a while, that spirit comes through. It rises from the deep somewhere. So like Philando Castillo, he was murdered. He was murdered even though he said, "Officer, I own a firearm." There's no like YouTube channel to tell a cop, "Hey, I own a firearm," and then shoot the cop. That doesn't happen, right? That's not like, it's not a challenge. It's not a thing we do. It doesn't make sense. There's no rational reason to believe I own a firearm would be connected with then shooting you. As a matter of fact, the one thing someone will never say to you before they shoot you is, "I'm sorry, I need to inform you, I own a firearm." That isn't how it works. Instead, it has to come from that history of black gun illegal. This black gun illegal is happening. I have to fight it. And that little bit of is that emotion that comes from this long history that's in the air. It's in our words, our deeds. It's in the media we consume. It's in the assumptions that we make when we talk to each other. That connection, that's where the police end up enforcing for the stock owners, the human livestock owners still. Like, for example, the big banks they own the payday lenders. And the payday lenders will give you $300, but they want back $360 in 2 weeks. So the people who can least afford, the people who most are incapable of getting by without that money, our demand for stock growth, stock wealth growth, forces us to have a system that rips from those people what little they already have. And so the big banks own those payday lenders. People are paying 400+%. That's the low end, 400% interest on their payday loans. And it's so that, my professor friends can have a better retirement portfolio. And what was happening? What was happening? Well, a little owner, right? Someone with a little shop, someone with a little stock, some sort of ownership said, oh, this person's out of line. And they called an officer. And the officer did what officers have always done. And that is take the people who step out of line and either put them back in line or kill them to set an example. And just like murdering Philando Castile and then acquitting the officer, the same thing we see over and over again. So, yeah, there's still some racism in America in those instances where white supremacy culture manifests. And then there's some racism in that 10% that still disapprove of interracial marriage.
So to really clarify what I am understanding, even though we transitioned from the conceptual slavery of livestock ownership, what this gives me a sense of is that our modern day stock market is actually still owning people as their livestock. Only it's a disconnection from knowing they own them.
Right. So if you own a little bit of Wells Fargo in your S&P 500 exchange traded fund, are you really charging 400% interest? Are you really the person whose fault it is that people are enslaved to these loans? And what if you're a good person, right? What if you're against that one thing, but that's just how the market's working? At the end of the day, we have to look at ourselves in the mirror and be honest about what our economic activity does. And so, yeah, there's 100% chance that the eventual outcome of having our money in stocks is to take that money to try and make more money. That's the point of the thing. And there's 100% chance that in investing to try and make more money, people are going to do bad things because all the good things have already been taken up to do, right? Now, there's also a 100% chance that there's some firms out there that'll make something amazing and world-changing and better because they had that money. But they could have done that without seeking an increase to the exponential growth of their profit. They could have done that just by seeking, like family businesses do, which are much more stable, enough profit for people to be happy with it who are the owners. So this system of using stocks to finance businesses and then requiring people in that 20% that have the real influence to buy into those stocks in order to retire, that's the core here, right? That's the continued ownership. And then what do you own, right? Like most of the stocks that we buy, they aren't because there's physical equipment. They're not because there's a bunch of land. It's not because you own a gold mine somewhere. No, you're buying people, right? You're buying people that are being employed, some of them in conditions that are abhorrent, that we wouldn't accept for ourselves, that we think are the worst. And then even the kindest people who have never experienced a lifetime of that sort of pain of living at the bottom say, oh, that's just a job for temporary children to take. And you know what? Yeah, in your world, right? In your world, you were a waitress for 2 years while you went to college. And then you got a nice job. And now everything's good and you have health care. Oh, and by the way, you had health care because of your parents while you were at college. And your parents were also helping with college. That is such a rarefied air, not just in the human experience, but in the American experience. People who can't afford $30 to buy formula, to buy diapers, to buy an inhaler, to buy insulin. People who can't afford that. But because your retirement portfolio needs more money, more people have to live like that. Yeah, it's the same system. And in a free market, the buyers and sellers are free. But in our stock ownership market, where the stock owners have a system in place through government that keeps us from all having money enough to live, which we could just do, right? We're spending $1 trillion a day to make sure that corporations don't go under. So that's maintaining the stock owner's wealth. So we have money that we could spend to give to people so that they don't die, so that they can choose whether or not to work. And I'll tell you a little secret. People like dignity. Everyone wants dignity. So if you give people enough that they're not impoverished anymore, that doesn't stop them from wanting the dignity of work. It just means that they'll only work at a place that's dignified. Could you imagine that? Could you imagine that you had to pay an extra 20 cents when you went and got a hamburger? And everyone working there felt like there was dignity to the job they were doing. Can you imagine that? Yeah, me either. It's hard.
So you say you have based this on science, and any particular science articles that we would need to be directed towards to enrich our learning?
Right. So the core of my research looks at the confluence of storytelling and identity, right? How do we come up with who we are by the stories we tell? The first thing we need to understand about our society, our lives, ourselves is this work by Ganzen, Islam, and Sotheby. Talks about spiritual entrepreneurship, the role of magical thinking in future-oriented sense-making. Now, what they're getting at there is that who we were and what we've experienced is nothing in comparison to what we believe we can be. And so as I encounter this concept of whiteness and I think about the history of how privilege and fragility go together, I think about that future. It's what my mentor Dave Boji calls an onto-narrative bet, a bet on the future. It's the many little things that might happen, that you think could happen, that you imagine happening, that you allow yourself to come into. And with that mentality, we can do what Neil deGrasse Tyson calls having intelligence. We can have intelligence. Intelligence, he says, is the ability to adapt to change. And another piece of research, neurons, memory neurons, are held together with glue in your brain. A lattice work of glue holds together that neuron. And every time we go back to a pleasant experience, we're remembering that previous pleasant experience. And every time we go back to an unpleasant experience. But whatever it is, pleasant, unpleasant, mundane, song stuck in your head, if we want to get rid of that, if we want to change, it physically hurts to tear that lattice work apart. And so what's really cool is that we can build these maps of meaning for ourselves, right? Like history, like who we can be, like our faith, that can help give us a stance outside of that lattice work we're about to tear apart, so we still have a sense of who we are. And that really, in Dr. Peterson's book here, lays out why we have the structures we do. We see that there are folks who are most concerned with maintaining the hard-won, hard-fought structures that we have. Take, for example, a society that says overtly, and for the vast majority, racism is bad, right? People want to preserve that. It's essential we preserve that. And when someone gets on TV and says, you're just race baiting, you're just creating race hostility by talking about race, that is something to think about, right? Because there's a long history of posseing up in your race and doing bad things. And how long has it been since we kind of decided not to do that? We only got to about 50% of people approving of interracial marriages in the 90s, right? And then all this change just hits people so fast, it starts tearing down their meaning, and they're afraid chaos will leak in. You know, you can tell the difference between that and folks who are looking to advance things. By how they respond to atheism. Now, most people are Christian in America, but if an American says, I can't understand how anyone could be ethical and atheist. If I was an atheist, I would just blah, blah, blah. That person is, in fact, afraid that without that bulwark against chaos, human life can have no meaning. But if we look at a long history, like we're not the first society to do this, right? To liberalize amidst strong religious beliefs. Soren Kierkegaard talks about love. And what we see here in his core argument is that you can't have real faith without doubt. So if your reason for faith is a fear of chaos, a fear of the pain of disbelieving, that's not faith of choosing to believe. It's only once we've died to that tradition and then chosen to come back into that grace that we have that. And that faith structure, and I'm talking about this as a scientist, right? That faith structure in the human mind is how our ideologies work in general, right? And if there's one reason, one thing or whatever, that if this, then that, and that is too awful to contemplate, therefore all of this side is correct, all whatever happens is fine. If that one thing still exists in someone's mind, they're incapable of adapting to a change. And so, whenever real push comes to shove, right? Like, whenever real push comes to shove and someone has to face how problematic their ideology is, either they can then give up that ideology and they become free to absorb into truth as their heart sees it with love, or they can prove once more how strong their ideology is. It's a question of ethics that Jesus taught us, okay? And it's a question of ethics that continues on down the line. It's called answerability ethics. So, and answerability ethics is best summarized in the story of the Good Samaritan. There's a man by the side of the road. The man is a Jew, and he's been beaten bloody. The good priest walks by and looks to the side of the road, and he sees the man beaten bloody. And the priest says, I will do nothing to help my fellow Jew because, of course, he is covered in blood, and it is against the rules to touch someone covered in blood. So he keeps on walking. See, that high priest, he's supposed to stand for good, supposed to stand for love, supposed to stand for God, but he stands more for his people, right? He stands more for his ideology. And then a Samaritan who is like, talk about dehumanized. You think that white superiority, white supremacy against blacks is bad. You think Arabs and Palestinians, Jews and Palestinians are bad, right? So much worse. So much worse. They recognize the other as a demon-infested dog, right? To touch each other is the most mortal of sins in your society. To give aid and comfort to this disgusting demon that has come to infest your land, that is how Jews saw Samaritans, and Samaritans saw Jews. Okay? But that Samaritan said, you know what? I don't care about my ideology. I care about the human being in front of me. I care about loving that person in front of me, and that is more important. That is more important than any ideology. So he went and he helped the Jewish person. And so, radical at the time, Jesus said, and the Samaritan did the right thing. And really, that's that core ethos. This is, so they say that America is a Christian nation. If we don't address that ideology under the surface, we don't get to the good that creates America, because we don't get to the good that is ignoring our ideologies, or even better, tearing down our ideologies, or even better, abolishing the way of thinking we feel is most core to who we are. If it actually helps a human being in front of us. And our ability to tell that from chaos is very limited. Very limited. It's an act of faith. It's an act of jumping off into the darkness and not knowing what you're going to land on when we go forth and accept that. But that, the understanding the stories we tell ourselves like that, understanding our faith, understanding how belief in the future can change the way we see ourselves, that's the core of the research that I do, right? That's what I study. And so understanding how to advance our knowledge around that and how that relates to creating new things in entrepreneurship, that's the point here, right? And so if we're going to talk about diversity, we have to step out of what diversity means and think about, what do we have left if I'm not white anymore, right? What am I? Well, you see, the thing is, when white's default, when everyone's white, then it's easy to say, oh, I don't care if I'm white or not. The question is, are you ready to accept behaviors that you would never do yourself because it's from a different culture, right? Or because it's from a different upbringing? Or because if they can do that, then why don't I do that? And then, no, that has to be wrong. And that's the internal struggle we all face when dealing with diversity, right?
So, how do you respond to people who say that they are not a race but individuals?
Oh, absolutely. So I would say the same thing I would say to a biologist who said that people are not individuals, they are made up of anatomy, who would then respond the same way to someone who would say, we're not made up of our anatomical biological parts, we're made up of atoms, right? For sure, 100%, we are made up of atoms. That's not going to get us very far in answering the important questions, right? It'll get us somewhere, and there are places for it. But many important questions are answered at the level of biology. And atoms, physics won't get you there. And the same, many important questions are addressed at the level of what is a person. And biology won't get you there. And the same, many important questions are answered at the level of, as who are we? Who am I in relation to other people? And that's where we get to this question of ideology we've been talking about, this question of ideas, this question of what it means to be a person and what are our stories? How do we relate with each other? And that is another level of being, right? That's another level to be with other people. Anyone who's been to church knows that. So, if someone tells you you are just a psyche, you are just in your head, that person is not part of building a community.
How would you respond to people who feel like their attempts to try to deconstruct this system by forcing them to talk to individuals that are different but still feel very fake in how they are addressing them?
You know, that's a really important question. So a lot of people know, okay, so I've got some privilege, so I'm white. I know that's bad for some reason. Like I shouldn't white at people or something. I don't know what I'm doing wrong and I want to stop, but I don't know what to do. Or, I know I should talk to some black people, but what is that? Like, it's talking to black people because they're black. Isn't that racism? So how do you engage authentically with anyone, right? If you went to go visit Scotland, would you talk to Scottish people? I would hope so, right? I'd hope you find some folks to talk to and get to know them. Just go where they are. Do you have a community center? Do you have a church? Does your denomination have a church nearby that's mostly black? Is there a denomination similar to your church that isn't heretical to yours, that has mostly black people in it? Because those are community opportunities to go get to know some people. Even easier than that, social media, Facebook, you can just click follow. You don't even have to be friends with someone to get their stuff in your newsfeed. Just click follow, and you'll see the most amazing things, right? I took this advice myself. I went and found some folks because most of the black people I know have graduate degrees, okay? And so I tried to find some people that were a little bit outside of that sphere, and the amount of stuff shared that is different than my world, right? Not at all in a bad way, just a different take on things, a different set of meanings given to the same experiences. It's helped enrich my own thinking, and it's helped me see different ways of engaging. Now, of course, I cheated. I was raised very white skin in a white family in South Texas, which is 92% Hispanic in any direction for 3 hours at least. So I know what it's like to exist in a majority culture that isn't the culture you're from, isn't the way you were raised at home, right? You are obviously from that culture, but it's not how you were raised at home. And then you become this weird mix of different cultures and ideas and things that you affiliate with, different ways of thinking about the world. When I look at the people, so I was raised in a Baptist church with a mostly white congregation, despite it being 92% Hispanic in every direction. But when I look at the people whose ideas I find myself affiliating with, middle-aged Hispanic women, right? So there's this weird world of interaction and thought and change and dynamics. All the people we work with, all of our taken for granted assumptions, what our behaviors and thoughts and words and how we address people, what that all means, that can be improved by being open to having those parts of our memory, our meaning just torn. Because we're open to change. We're open to hearing. We're open to experiencing a world from someone else's perspective. It's entirely possible, yeah. So, and what I find here is that when we look at the research on unconscious bias, very few people have a very big difference in their unconscious bias. As a matter of fact, it can come down to, most often, about 1/3 of a second. That doesn't seem like much when it comes to how quickly you can react to things. But when an officer has to decide if a gun's getting drawn and someone's going to shoot, that unconscious bias, that 1/3 of a second makes all the difference. Do I run down the path of believing in a deadly future or a safe future? And we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that the long history of impoverishment, the long history of livestock ownership perpetuated in our current stock ownership system, it creates a body that experiences trauma. And when our bodies experience trauma, our minds put that away without words, without narrative. You just put it away as an image or a set of feelings. And then when the triggers are all around us, a flood of emotions, a flood of experiences, a flood of memories, a flood of visions, just like that trauma. So, police with guns traumatize Black people, who traumatize police with guns, because if you spend all day, every day in an impoverished neighborhood, you're going to run into more people behaving criminally. If you then spend it in an impoverished neighborhood that is mostly black, and we have this long history of black and white, even if we would like to abolish race and have it return to an ethnicity like Italian or Irish, since we still have this race superiority built into who we are, we start cueing, so it's these people that do that thing. Even the black, Hispanic, the people of color in the police force still exist in this world where their assumption becomes whatever they experience. So if they patrol a black neighborhood and that's the crime they run into, even if the crime rate weren't just the same, even if it were half, even if the crime rate were half what it is amongst black people as white people, the fact of patrolling a neighborhood is the fact of experiencing the people in that neighborhood, which is necessarily experiencing that small few are committing crimes. So those people committing crimes become your archetype for crime. And so the body keeps the score. And it remembers what happened, and it comes flooding back. People in that sort of traumatic situation shouldn't be carrying firearms.
I have another question. So you're saying a lot of our systems are built on the invention of whites, and we explored the gun ownership and how it's manifested. Can we explore how we are still controlling their vote?
So, Hannah Arendt here. She speaks to the difference between labor and work. Right? Labor we do so that we can live. Work we do so that we can have pride in what we create. And one of the most important works we engage in every generation is the recreation and novel creation of what she calls a storytelling field. This energy of stories we tell ourselves. One of the most fundamental stories of our people is that of voting. And like we saw with the invention of whiteness in order to tear people apart, Nixon started pushing for laws that would make felons out of black people, make felons out of hippies. His intention was to deny the vote to a group of people because they disagreed with his political party. Now, if your political party is so dead set on victory at all costs that it can't handle adjusting to a point where it can attract a majority of people, then maybe your ideas need to change. But that many years ago, 50 years ago now, just about, we started tearing apart the storytelling field of us as a nation. And we started putting in a move back to white supremacy, where we had pushed against it. And maybe the push was so hard that some people's minds just weren't ready for it. And we've hard fought for acceptance, approval of interracial marriage. And the story we tell each generation changes. Gen X had a belief in gay rights and a changing of that storytelling field to expand human rights. There's a strong undercurrent to the next generation of accepting people no matter their gender identity. And what we need is to recognize not just what can move in the future, because that's getting to fewer and fewer people that are being marginalized, but also the people that have been left behind in all of this change, which is, I studied Elkhart County, hardest hit county in the '08 downturn. And during the Obama recovery, they got their jobs back, but their pay went on average from $60,000 a year working in RV manufacturing to $40,000. That doesn't feel like a recovery. Now, the social narrative that they were told is that the Mexicans came and stole their jobs. There's too many Mexicans. They offer too much for the labor. Therefore, we can pay you less because supply and demand. Mexicans supply, therefore your demand is less, therefore you get less money. And that's just not true. The number of Hispanic persons in the county went down dramatically. But what happened was that county has a lot of Amish people, and Amish people don't believe in unions. They don't believe in lots of hierarchical things. And a lot of Amish people go to work, right? Or at least people near Amish still have that sort of ideology. And so the RV manufacturers figured out they have a population of people they can exploit. And what happened was the amount of money that used to go to labor went down, and the amount of money that goes to the stock owners went up. And they've been doing it over and over again. Just before the '08 downturn, Elkhart wasn't booming. Elkhart was almost recovered from the downturn in 2001. Elkhart boomed most recently, that's for sure. And still, the ratio of income is going to the stock owners. And that's a story we're telling ourselves. Like, that's so I can retire, right? That's so the people in this group of folks, mostly with college degrees, can have more money than their Social Security would pay for retirement. And so, I mean, there's a solution to that, right? Just don't have retirement pegged to the stock market. Lots of states have their money, like even if it's a pension fund, a lot of states are trying to fund those pension funds with returns that are better than what they're getting right now in safe investments, but those investments aren't safe. So they're going after dangerous investments because they need a return. And there's just no wealth left to extract from the earth. So what do? Right? They have to do something. They have to extract it somewhere. And so it comes from the deals that were made before when there were unions, the deals that were made before when there were worker protections, the deals that were made before under a different social contract. They tell their story of them getting more and more wealthy, them being me, right? People who don't earn their income, don't earn their wealth, but get it from putting their money to work, right? And so, how do you maintain that? Well, who can vote on a Tuesday, right? Someone without the absolute need to work on a Tuesday, right? These people can't afford $30, much less half a day to stand in line to go vote. It's just a way to make sure voting is limited. And, you know, America started with blacks and whites and non-landowners voting, right? Not America. Like, the colonies in America had the vote for the worker. And then stock owners, they said, I'm not going to keep making my returns this way. And it pushed it straight into chattel slavery in a generation or two. But we had it. We had very close to what we want. And we can have it again.
Can we also explore the impact that we are still having on mate availability?
This patriarchy is enforced by gun ownership, reinforced by the police, and enabled by this fear of the dark-skinned person taking women away. 100 years ago, it was a common trope in popular media, in books, in the first movies, a Semitic or black person stealing a white woman, raping her, and then her falling in love with him. And it was a morality play for white men, not to trust black men or brown men, for they will steal your women. But we see people are afraid of the thing they're already doing happening to them, right? So this is an unspoken but absolutely real problem in our society. We may not overtly say something like, I don't approve of interracial marriage, but somewhere in the heart of many perfectly liberal white women, when a brown or black man is near a young white woman, they get afraid of sexual harassment. And I mean, it's not to downplay sexual harassment in the least. It's to say that the power dynamic there, if it's not understood in terms of historic bigotry against persons of color, can easily turn into a way to perpetuate white supremacy through the position of white women taking offense, which is something we've seen over and over again, right? So a black man was not allowed to address a white woman in the South and also in the North, right? There is a long, long history of bigotry across the United States. It's not just a South thing. That's just where they put the laws in place. Everyone else didn't need laws. They just knew what to do. And that sort of bigotry continues on today against black and brown people, persons of color, especially in liberal places. Because if they were biased, that would make them bad people, so they can't possibly be bad people. And they tell them this lie. They tell themselves this lie. Why? We weren't the slavers, so it's all okay. I'll tell you, Abraham Lincoln said that he, of course, did not believe the white man and the black man were equal. Obviously, blacks were inferior to whites. He just didn't think they should be slaves. Was that mere rhetoric? He would be the only human being presenting that as mere rhetoric at the time. Right? Was he saying it just to get elected? I think he came from the heart. True liberals at the time when it came to Native relations, and there's this huge erasure of Native Americans in this whole story, and that's because that's not the story that's being told right now. But the most liberal-minded at the turn of the last century said something like, don't kill the native in the native. That mindset still exists. It absolutely exists. It's the mindset that says, we should have an America where everyone has the right to act like a white man. And if you act like a white man, then you're a decent human being. And so you deserve all the privileges that go with it. But as soon as you act in some other way, oh my. And that's the core of it, right? Can we accept people who exist in an upbringing, in a world, in a bunch of assumptions that we don't share? Or do we judge people's character not based on answerability ethics, not based on the people who are hurt or not, but instead based on how well they conform to our assumptions about what proper, decent people look like. And we see it with patriarchy as well, right? So women, for example, who have children suffer severely when it comes to their income. This doesn't have to be the case. It doesn't happen in Denmark. And in Denmark, you don't see nearly the inequality when it comes to top executives. And every little thing adds up, especially at the outlier condition, right? At the furthest end of the furthest outcome, someone is a CEO. And to get all the way out there, you have to have all the breaks, right? You have to be smart. You have to be hardworking, no question at all. You also have to have not gotten sick. But a kind of medical condition is being pregnant, right? And if you got sick, you got better and you were taken care of. But being pregnant isn't taken care of here, right? We don't give people the ability to be absent from work. Socially, we don't give them the ability to be absent to work. It's not about paid family sick leave. It's about if Tom has a kid and he comes into work every day, he's a team player and he's moving up around here. And I don't know why Jane didn't do the exact same thing. Because in this America, everyone has the right to act like a white guy. So that's the concept of diversity that we're dealing with, you know? And this is the conflict. Is it everyone has a right to act like a white guy? Or is it we take people on the value of their character in terms of who they hurt or help instead of how well do they match my ideal and my ideology? It happens on both sides. There are definitely hateful people on the left as there are on the right. People who are ready to throw a punch because someone's a Christian, right? All sorts of craziness goes on because without love, how can we come together? We only have fear, right? And this is important. There are very few hate groups. And even if you go talk to a hate group, like go talk to the Aryan Brotherhood, they don't spend their time talking about how much they hate black people. They spend their time talking about how much they love white people. Love. Love not for your fellow human being. Love for those who share your ideology. That is the origin of hate. Because if you have an ideology and you must believe it in it and you would feel this pain and you would be destroyed if it changed, then anyone who might disagree with you is a threat. It's not that you just love everyone in here and you're afraid of the people out there. You don't hate them, but you might have to fight them because you're afraid. But if we just let ourselves realize, hey, this little core ideology I have, it's nothing. It's just made up, right? What's real here? What's real is human suffering. Loving our fellow human being. The actual physical pain people suffer. Not, did they match my ideology right? Did they say person of color instead of colored person, right? It's a challenge. It's the challenge that I hear over and over again in church. It's the challenge I see over and over again when it comes to good research. It's the challenge I see constantly when people are great educators. It is, how do I lay myself down and be here for the person in front of me? And so that's a difficulty we all have, right? It's a difficulty we all have, especially when we feel like our people are under assault from them, so we're afraid and we have to fight. But it doesn't have to be that way.